Ever look at your miniatures and just think, why does it still feel flat, and wonder why some miniatures look incredibly realistic and others just look painted? A lot of the time this difference isn't just paint, it's texture. And in this video I'm going to show you 5 simple and effective ways to add texture on your models, whether you're working on fabric, armour, flesh or weathering. I'm Nate the Feral Painter and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. So why do we even add texture to models, and why is it even important? We add texture to miniatures because real world surfaces aren't smooth or the same. Different materials have different visual looks and details. Some are worn, layered, scratched, dusty or even pitted. And when everything on a model has the same sort of smooth finish, it can all blend together visually, but once you start to introduce some texture, those different materials start to read different and separate from each other. Armour can feel hard and worn, cloth can feel a little bit more soft, and leather feels slightly rough, and metal can even feel gritty and decaying. Texture helps separate different parts of the model because light reacts differently to each surface. Rough areas catch highlights in broken and irregular ways, and that variation creates some contrast, and contrast is what helps the eye distinguish one element from another. It also improves the readability of the model as well from a distance. A lot of it comes down to the scale, because the miniatures that we're working with are quite small, and so as modelers we tend to exaggerate contrast and textures to make details visible at arm's length, and subtle sculpted details can sort of disappear under paint, and if everything is treated in the same way. Adding texture does give those areas a lot of definition and makes each section of the model visually distinct. But in short, texture creates material contrast and improves the light interaction, and it also helps every part of the miniature clearly communicate what it's supposed to be. So let's start off with the most basic way of adding some texture to our models, and this is just quite simply using acrylic paints. By changing the way that we apply acrylic paints, we can quickly and effectively add texture to our models, especially in how they read visually. Instead of base coating everything smoothly and then building up clean progressive edge highlights, we can adjust our application technique to create different surface qualities. So let's take a cape for example, and this applies to most fabrics as well, and if we want the surface to feel worn and slightly pitted or full of little subtle imperfections, and instead of using smooth brush strokes, we can turn to stippling. Stippling is one of my favourite ways to build fast, easy visual texture, and I like using these dome-shaped brushes, but honestly any brush will work with this effect as long as you can stipple with it. And I start by gently dabbing at the surface and slowly building up layers as I work towards my highlights. Applying paint this way will leave behind tiny irregular little marks, and when those marks build up in layers, they visually read as broken textured fabric while still preserving the shadows and highlights underneath. This same stippling technique works really well as well on armor plates, and on armor it creates a chipped mottled effect that makes the surface feel worn and battle damaged. There are some other applicators out there like a sponge, and sponging is a little bit even faster, and it creates a slightly different pattern and texture as you apply it, and I definitely recommend experimenting with different tools and products to see what interesting results you can achieve by this stippling method. There are other ways to build texture using just a brush as well. Take metallics for example. Dry brushing metallic paint naturally leaves behind these tiny microscopic marks and scratches, which instantly adds some visual texture to that surface. And on fabric or armour you can also paint in fine lines and scratches to suggest some wear and tear. And for flesh for example, you might flick or speckle tiny amounts of paint onto there just to create some subtle mottling and variation in that skin. Now, adding visual texture with acrylic paints can dramatically improve how a model looks, but it does come with its own limitations, and because at the end of the day it's still just visual texture, it doesn't really change the physical surface. So now let's take a look at how we can combine these techniques with actual physical texture and the products that we can use to bring even more realism to our miniatures. My favourite and probably easiest way to add some physical texture is by using putties. These putties allow us to apply a thin layer directly onto the surface and subtly manipulate that finish, creating a slightly rough texture to work from. And once they're dry, they cure hard and can be painted over without any issues. There are quite a few options on the market, things like liquid green stove, Tamiya putty and other similar products. They all have a slight different properties to them, but in terms of application and the final effect, they achieve very similar results. So let's start with some fabric first of all, and I usually grab an old brush and lightly stipple the putty onto that surface. The key here is to build up slowly so you don't overwhelm the actual sculpt or obscure any details, and for this, scale is really important. We're working on miniatures, so being subtle goes quite a long way, so start light and you can always add more if needed. But as that putty tends to and starts to dry, I like to go back over that surface again and gently break it up even more just by adding some more stippling to that area with nothing on my brush. And on fabric, I tend to apply this mainly to the lower areas or places where natural wear and distressing would occur. This same method works really well on armor plates as well. Scale modelers often use it to replicate rolled steel textures or even light corrosion on tanks and vehicles, and on miniatures it gives armor a more rugged, battle-worn feel. Just be careful not to obscure any important details. It's very easy to go heavy-handed and lose sculptured features, and the key here is to apply it in a controlled manner. But one extra tip, and once everything is fully dry, you can lightly sand over that surface, and this just knocks back any overly raised areas and slightly refines that texture as well, giving you a different finish to work with. I definitely recommend experimenting with this method. You can go as heavy for some extreme wear or keep it quite subtle for more natural effect, but just always keep in mind the scale and the level of wear that you're trying to achieve in mind. Next up, we can turn to texture paste or special effects acrylics to add even more physical texture. This isn't something that I personally use all the time, and I do see these products being slightly overused in the community, especially when they're applied a little bit too heavily. It is totally fine to do that if you're going for a very specific look or the actual project calls for it, but just like before, we really need to take and keep in mind the scale of the models that we're working on. For example, it wouldn't really make sense to use heavy gritted texture paste on fabric. At this scale, fabric wouldn't naturally have large chunks of grain embedded in it, and at least not if we still want it to read as cloth. It'd make more sense to apply those kind of effects, such as your mud splats and everything, right at the end so that it does actually read as mud and grit. Instead, we need to think about the results that we're trying to achieve. I do find that these sorts of texture paste work much better on metal areas where you want to suggest some corrosion, and when applied to the arm plates or some mechanical surfaces, they can instantly start to imply some rust in decay or pitted steel. I personally prefer to use something like Typhus Corrosion because Typhus Corrosion does have a much finer grain or granular effect. And some basing like products like the ones that we might use on our bases tend to contain the larger grit or the larger granules, which can look very oversized on smaller miniatures that we tend to paint. That said though, those heavier textures can work really well on larger vehicles or terrain pieces, and it all comes back to the scale that we're doing. Again, I apply these sparingly and usually stipple these on to the areas where corrosion would naturally form, around rivets, recesses or lower sections where moisture would collect. Another product that's worth mentioning, which is in line with these products, is crackle paint. Crackle paints are quite unique. When you apply them, they dry and begin to split and crack on their own. And this is a great way to introduce a completely different type of texture compared to the other materials that we've gone over. I like to use crackle effects on fabrics for some subtle aging, on armour for chipped or flaking paint, and even to suggest some peeling skin. You can actually control the size of the cracks by adjusting how thickly that you do apply it, but thicker layers create larger cracks and thinner layers create finer ones. But just keep in mind that different brands behave slightly different and depending on your temperature, so it's just always a good idea to test it on something spare before committing to your final piece. So just to quickly recap with the texture paste, it's not to say that you should use certain ones on different items or different sections of the model. It all just comes down to what you require. You know, a lot of people may want to paint quick and just add a little bit of texture to their clothing, and that's perfectly fine. You know, if you're doing something fast or for like in a pinch, it would really work that way. But what I'm trying to suggest with these is to really think about the placement and building them up slowly. It wouldn't really make sense to use one single texture paste like a muddy ground on the clothing and then put some onto the weapons and then put some onto the metallic areas, because everything will just read the same. Maybe, you know, if you're just painting one miniature and it's got a little bit of clothing, you could actually put a little bit of that onto the lower portions, because it sort of makes sense. Even though the scale might be a little bit out or anything like that, it'll still read as a tattered clothing. But maybe, you know, if you're going to add a couple of these to all different sections of your model, it's just worth taking into consideration the size of them. So you may use the larger texture paste on some heavier corrosion, and then you might come down to the smaller granules or even the crackle paint to be able to achieve different results depending on what it is that you're painting on the model. It's just so that each section's got something different and it'll also read differently, and not as though everything's got the same large parts on it. But also, if you are going to add these, if you want it to be a mud effect, it wouldn't make sense as well to add it to the clothing and then paint it as trousers. If that's going to be dirt and grime, it makes sense to apply it after. But I hope that's been a little bit of an insight to you in regards to texture paste. I've given a few different variants that you can use and apply and implement within your miniature painting. Another really effective way to introduce texture is by using Villainy Ink enamels. These are specifically designed with the Grimdark style in mind, and what makes them interesting is that they don't just add a grime or effects, some also have a slight texture in its formulation. For example, Goon's Grime has a very slight granular quality to it, and once it's applied and settled onto the model, under closer inspection you can see that fine granulation, and it reads as in-scale dirt and environmental grime that's naturally built up over time. It's subtle, but that's what makes it believable. Carrion Crimson works in a very similar way, but it's aimed more at flesh, gore and mottled effects. It contains these tiny granules that are slightly bigger than Goon's Grime, and when it's applied to the skin, those little granules are left behind and that reddish broken texture, and it's that uneven finish that helps create a more organic, irritated or distressed look to the flesh without you having to manually stipple or paint everything in. Then there's also Decay of Death and All is Dust. These tend to dry slightly different, with a more chalky and a matte finish depending on how you manipulate them. But it's that chalky finish that leans more into surface finish variation, which is a completely different subject all by itself, but it's still a form of texture. Even subtle changes in the surface finish can dramatically affect how the lighting interacts with the model. And what's great about these enamels is that they layer beautifully over the other techniques that we've previously spoke about. They're not necessarily replacing physical texture or stippling, they're enhancing the work that we've already done, and they add another level of depth and realism, especially if you're aiming for a weathered grimdark aesthetic. But if you are interested in grabbing some of the Villainy Inks for yourself, not just for the texturing purposes, but also some of the weathering and special effects, then some of the models that you've seen in this video, you can head over to the grimdarkcompendium.com and grab some of them for yourselves. We do combine these as well with course bundles, so if there is a course on there or a faction that does take your fancy and you want to dive deeper into the Grimdark style, then you can head over there and grab them for yourself. And this is just the best way that you can support us and the work that we do here. Finally, we can turn to soft pressing to add even more texture and visual interest. Soft pressing creates real physical indentations and surface scratches that often look far more realistic than the painted on damage. This is because you're actually altering the surface and the light catches those marks naturally. The process is quite simple. You use a sharp tool, something like an old airbrush needle or sewing needle, or even a straightened paperclip, and gently drag this across the painted surface. This will leave behind small scratches and imperfections that suggest genuine wear and tear on your model. This technique works really well on both fabric and metal, and on fabric it can create subtle fraying or distressing, and on armour or weapons it produces fine scratches that feel authentic because they are physically altering that surface and they're not just painted on. When doing this though, it's just keep in mind to use very light pressure and slowly pull the tool across that surface. Vary your angles and directions so that the marks feel natural and not too uniform, and in some cases you can apply a little bit more pressure for some deeper scratches, but be careful, it's very easy to go too far and cut through the paint down to the bare plastic, so just take your time and build it up gradually. There are more advanced variations of this technique and ways to layer it with paint effects, but just at its core, it's simply about adding small, gentle scratches to break up those smooth surfaces and introduce another level of realism. So now that we've covered these 5 methods, it's worth saying that there are plenty of other ways to add textures to your models without even using the techniques mentioned here. A lot of it simply comes down to the materials that you choose during the build itself, things like cloth, paper, wire and other everyday items, and some of those were covered in our previous video where Echoes of Vermin talks about 3 mundane items that you can use for miniature kit bashing. Elements like that will bring their own natural texture straight away, which can add instant visual interest before you even start painting. But hopefully this video has shown you just how simple it can be to completely change the look of your models by introducing a few small adjustments. Texture doesn't just have to mean heavy or overdone, even subtle changes can dramatically improve how a model reads. The best part is that all of these methods that I've just taught can be used together. Layering them thoughtfully can create a model that feels richer, more believable, and far more visually engaging. I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and until next time guys, I will catch you in the next video.